When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of the Seat at the Table special series, I am joined by a fellow podcaster, April from the Door Key podcast. April, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Jerry. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited.
Well, and it's been nice to get to know you through social media. We connected, I think it was a few months back, and I started listening to your podcast, interacting on social media. And so I was like, April's got to come on Seat at the Table. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. I'm so excited.
Well, before we dive into the life and career of our cabinet member, I want to give you an opportunity to share more about your podcast with our audience. If you haven't listened already, let us know where we can find you. And I'll also be sharing information around the release of this episode on social media. But April, tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Okay. My podcast is called Door Key. That's 2 words, door and key. It's a play on the word dorky. And I thought it was fitting because I'm a huge dork and I love history, and I really enjoy talking about it and finding things out about it. So, yeah.
You're in good company. I think all of us history podcasters started because we were just we were already talking about it with our loved ones, and we were like, well, we've got to share the love with other people that we don't know.
Yes.
Well, and I know you cover a variety of topics. How do you pick topics for your podcast?
Oh gosh. Really, it's just things that I find interesting. I started with the Tudors, with Henry Tudor, Henry VIII and his wives, because I've always been interested, and I just kind of went on from there. I don't pick a particular time era or anything. I go as far back as Ötzi the Iceman to as far ahead as Studio 54.
I love it. And that's the thing, with history, and it's interesting, with my podcast being based on U.S. presidential history, most folks think that that's going to be just kind of, one train of thought, one line about the presidents. But as listeners have seen, I've expanded it to so many different things. It's nice to be able to have that variety. And when you don't even have that restriction and can just explore whatever is interesting to you in history, I love it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I'm definitely having a lot of fun with it.
And you just celebrated your 50th episode, correct?
I did. Yes. I can't believe it.
I know. It's nice when we get to those milestones. It's like, oh my gosh, I really am doing this.
Yes. And I asked people to send in questions, and I thought, oh, well, I'll make an episode where I answer. And people actually did send in questions. And I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it.
I love it. And I know you probably feel the same way as me. That's one of the best things about podcasting. You don't realize it until you really start the audience, and getting that interaction with folks who share that passion of history is just phenomenal. It's so amazing.
Yes. Yes. It's been really nice to connect with people and, to connect with you. Like when you joined my Facebook group, I was like, that's not the Jerry Landry, because I listened to your podcast and then it turns out it was, and I was like, oh my gosh, that was very exciting.
Well, it's wonderful, like I said, to have gotten in touch with you through social media and to actually have a chance to talk with you. And we're going to be talking about a cabinet member who is not one of the more well-known ones, but that's what I love about the series, is getting to explore some of the lesser-known individuals and seeing what they contributed to the story. And so I shared with April that we are going to be talking about Benjamin Crowninshield, who was the Secretary of the Navy. But April, had you heard of Benjamin Crowninshield before we started talking about doing this episode?
I had not. This was all brand new information to me. It was very interesting. I was like, oh my gosh.
Well, and astute listeners may remember that we did talk about a Crowninshield back in the day. We're actually going to bring that up in this episode. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and start at the beginning.
This episode is brought to you by CarMax. Boldly searching for your next used vehicle? With CarMax, you don't have to settle on anything when it comes to your ride. Instead, steer clear of the ordinary and buy the car that's right for you. Because CarMax makes it easy to stop settling and find a car you'll love today. Start shopping now at CarMax.com. CarMax, the way car buying should be.
Benjamin Williams Crowninshield was born in Salem, Massachusetts on December 27th, 1772. He was the son of George and Mary Derby Crowninshield. Now, while I can't confirm the full number of siblings he had, we do know that he at least had two older brothers, George, who was born in 1766, and Jacob, who was born in 1770. He also had two younger sisters, Mary, who was born in 1778, and Sarah, born in 1784. So given the conditions of the time, and this is something that comes up in See It at the Table, just unfortunately, it was a time likely the parents had other children that did not survive to adulthood. But just in my research, I wasn't able to find anything about that. But more than likely, that was the case. Now, as noted by Benjamin's granddaughter, Louisa, in a memoir that she had published privately in the 1920s, the Crowninshield family can trace its lineage back to a physician named Johann Caspar Richter von Crowninshield. And he apparently came over to Massachusetts in 1660 and settled at Lynn before moving first to Salem, then to Boston. So he has some roots in at least a couple of generations in Massachusetts. And the family apparently made a move back to Salem at some point, as Benjamin's father, George, was also born in that town in 1734. He was a successful trading merchant who became, quote, the head of a firm of ship owners having offices in Salem and New York. So this is a family, they are merchants. This is something that's rather common when we're talking about Massachusetts at the time. That was one of the big, shipping and trading was a big industry in Massachusetts at the time.
Yes.
And so his father, John, had been a mariner born in Boston, but it seems he moved to Salem at some point, as he passed away and was buried there nearly 12 years prior to Benjamin's birth. Mary had also been born in Salem a few years later in 1737, and it appears that her family had been in Salem for at least a couple of generations back. So again, on both sides, they do have those connections to Massachusetts and specifically to Salem going back a couple of generations. Now, naturally, as Benjamin was 3 when independence was declared and turned 9 a couple of months after the Battle of Yorktown was concluded, Benjamin did not serve in the Revolutionary War.
I would hope not at that age.
Let's hope. I mean, he's not even ready for drummer boy status. So.
No.
Now, I didn't find any record of any of the family serving in the conflict or of any impact that it had on the family. You do have to assume, and especially, with a merchant family, there was some disruption. There were things that happened, but just wasn't able to really find any details on that. The Biographical Directory of the United States Congress notes that Benjamin, quote, prepared for college at some point, but unfortunately gives no information on whether he actually went to college. So this is one of those mysterious, we really don't know much about his early life and education.
Right.
But what we do know is the following from historian Frederick C. Lanier. Quote, he, i.e. Crowninshield, had gone to sea as a cabin boy and rose to master of Salem ships to the East Indies by the time he turned 20, along with 4 of his brothers. And so we do know that he at least had a couple of other brothers. Benjamin came ashore to work with his father as a merchant in the family counting house, George Crowninshield and Sons. So he's getting an early start, and it seems a pretty successful start in the family business. By 1807, his father, George, was estimated to be worth $16 million, which
wow.
in 2020 dollars, that is $280 million.
Holy moly.
They are doing rather well for themselves.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
And so this firm, the successful firm, was split into 3 by the father and sons in 1809. And at that point, the full company, quote, owned a dozen ocean-going ships rated between 250 and 500 tons and were the leading American merchants in the pepper trade with the East Indies.
Wow.
So that's one of those things. And we talked about this with one of Crownshield's predecessors, William Jones, who was also a merchant. This trade with the East Indies and with Asia, the Pacific trade, it could be riskier, but it was also a trade that was very lucrative if everything worked out according to plan. And so it sounds like that was kind of the trade that they were really going for, those high dollar trade with the Pacific trade. And Lanier notes that Benjamin was, quote, said to have been the solid brains of the firm.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, he's doing good and starting out, very strong as a young man and getting involved in this lucrative business. So he's already got some success under him. But he wasn't the only one. His older brother Jacob had made a name for himself enough to rise to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1802. And for those podcast listeners who may have recognized that name of Crowninshield, we talked about him because we talked about Jacob because in 1805, his reputation was such that President Jefferson offered Jacob the post of Secretary of the Navy in his administration. But though he was quickly confirmed by the Senate, Jacob ultimately declined the offer. He wrote this letter to Jefferson. He's like, well, I'd rather be with my family. I've got some other things going on, which if he's involved in this lucrative trade, he may not want to mess that up.
Yeah.
I'm good just staying in the House of Representatives, doing that little side gig while I'm really focusing on the merchant.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, Jacob met his untimely demise in 1808 at the age of 38. So fortunately, family lost this brother. But Benjamin also was establishing a family. He met Mary Boardman Derby, and the two were wed in 1804. So Mary had been born in May 1778, and she was 5 years younger than her husband. Her sister had married Benjamin's brother Jacob, and Mary's brother Elias, quote, was well known in Salem as a rich shipbuilder and merchant. So all of these Salem connections and family connections kind of drawing them together. So their first child, Elizabeth, was born later in 1804. So I'm assuming they were married earlier in the year with at least 9 months in between the wedding and the birth. We don't really know for certain, but we'll just go ahead and give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Their daughter named Mary was born in 1806, and a son named Benjamin, of course, after the father, was born at some point either before or after Mary. But though he's mentioned, no birth year is given for him.
Okay.
But we do have more of a description of the birth of their fourth child, a son named Francis, as it was one of his children, Louisa, who wrote her reminiscences later on. So this was like a family, trying to collect the family story. And so since it was her father, she knew more about his birth.
Okay.
Louisa recorded that her father was born in April 1809 at the family's brick house in Salem, which we'll talk more about that in a minute, and that he, quote, was such an enormous baby that the father in charge said he must weigh him and rushed out to procure scales for the purpose. The child weighed 16 pounds, an almost unheard of weight for a newborn baby.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I was like, wow. That's a detail you would remember.
Yes. Wow. Can I just say that poor woman?
I know.
I'm sorry.
No. That poor woman. He was further described as having, quote, lovely dark blue eyes like his mother and dark curly hair. So at least she could say, once she recovered from the childbirth experience, oh, he has my eyes.
Yes, there is that. Oh my goodness.
No, we don't know for certain that she waited a few years to have another child, but the next child that we know of was a son named George, born in 1812.
I mean, could you blame her?
Yeah, I'm just gonna need a little more time.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
You remember that 16-pound baby?
Do we know how much this baby weighed?
We don't. I'm hoping not 16 pounds.
I would hope not.
That poor woman deserves a little bit of a break.
Yes. Although I think just about anything would be a break compared to that.
Yes.
She's like, oh, this birth was an easy one.
You want me to chop down that large tree in the yard? I'll do that. I'll do that over 16-pound babies.
Yes.
So I mentioned the home, though it was listed as having been constructed in 1810, as Louisa records that her father was born in the home in 1809. Either there may be some question about the date, or 1810 was when the construction was completed, but the family may have been living there already, or Louisa could have just been mistaken. It was this, more than likely gathering family stories and all of that. So we don't really know, but somewhere in that point, 1809, 1810, Benjamin constructed a new home for the family on Derby Street that is described as a, quote, graceful red brick mansion.
Oh.
Yeah. And the multi-story home was designed by well-renowned local architect Samuel McIntyre. So, new home, the family's growing, the mother's trying to recover. And meanwhile, Benjamin is continuing with his career. So in 1811, not only did he become president of the Merchants Bank of Salem, Crowninshield was also elected as a member of the Massachusetts State House of Representatives. Then at some point in 1812, he was elevated to the state senate. So he's following his brother's footsteps, getting started in politics. When the nation went to war against Britain in 1812, quote, the Crowninshields converted their merchant ships into privateers and renewed their fortunes in the prize game. One of the dozens of privateers in which they had an interest or owned outright, their ship America, took 26 prizes on 4 cruises during the war, reputedly yielding $1 million in sales. So
wow,
they're aiding the war effort and making a profit.
Okay.
Sadly, in November 1813, Benjamin's mother Mary passed away in Salem at the age of 76. Meanwhile, in the next year in Washington, as discussed in his episode, so we mentioned him earlier, Secretary of the Navy William Jones had opted, after an action-packed couple of years in office, to make his exit, so President Madison had to consider replacements. He first offered the role to Commodore John Rogers as, quote, a tribute to Rogers's administrative abilities and judgment about ships and strategy. But there were just a couple of problems with this. First, Attorney General Richard Rush informed Madison that active military officers could not serve on the cabinet, and Rogers did not want to give up his commission in order to serve in the cabinet. So this is something, and we kind of saw this pretty recently with the current Secretary of the Defense, who was a general. President Biden offered him the role. He had to go ahead and resign his commission because active officers cannot be in the cabinet. They can't serve in that civilian office.
I think that's a fair rule.
I think that is a fair rule. And especially when you're going to be the head of the office that's one of the branches of the military, probably not a good idea.
Yeah, I agree.
So thus, the president went back to the drawing board and he looked around for a civilian with a maritime background. Naturally, his eye went to New England Democratic Republicans. And by this point, thanks to his brother Jacob, the Crowninshield name was known in Washington. Thus, on December 15, 1814, Madison wrote to Benjamin Crowninshield to offer him the post, deeming him, quote, a desirable successor to Jones, and informing him that his name had already been sent to the Senate, which quickly confirmed him. And this is one of those interesting things at the time, and we've seen this with numerous of the Madison cabinet members. The president, without even asking the person, sent in the name for confirmation and just kind of hoped, are they going to take it? Are they not?
John Adams did that a lot as well, I think, correct?
Yes. Yes. And sometimes it worked and sometimes not so much.
Yeah.
Now, as noted by historian Christopher McKee, and as we discussed in William Jones' episode, though Jones had provided a logistical mind and a firm hand at restructuring the Navy to be more effective, Madison needed in his successor, quote, someone able to do a repair job on the human relations component of the secretarial assignment. You know, Jones, he knew the logistics. He knew how to make things work, but he wasn't always the best about dealing with the people involved. And so Madison's looking for somebody, now that we've got kind of the logistics worked out, let's work on the human element of the Navy.
Okay, you saying that just kind of made some of the things I've read about this guy make a little more sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he's a little more political than...
Exactly, than Jones, yeah.
Got it.
And it didn't hurt that Crowninshield was from New England, which is a region that the Democratic Republicans struggled to gain a foothold in. You know, we talked about this in the Jefferson presidency, and it's still in the Madison presidency. New England is still kind of this stronghold for Federalists. And so they've been trying to work to, get some inroads, establish some strong leaders there. So Madison would later write that his choice of Crowninshield, quote, added to a stock of practical good sense, a useful stock of nautical experience and information, and an accommodating disposition. However, as described by Lanier, quote, overwhelmed at receiving such a letter from the president, modest about his talents, and reluctant to leave 5 young children at home with his wife, who was expecting their 6th child, Crowninshield first hesitated, then declined the job, and finally wrote Madison on December 28th, 1814, that he accepted. So he's really not going into this feeling, guess, no, maybe, yes, I'll do it. Due to the difficulties of travel from New England in the winter at the time, so travel in general was just difficult. But you put this into New England and you may have a nor'easter coming up. It was difficult. And it would take a couple of weeks for Crowninshield to make his way south to the nation's capital. However, he soon set off to begin this new phase of his career. And so on January 16th, 1815, Crowninshield assumed office as the 5th U.S. Secretary of the Navy. Now, historian Frederick C. Lanier describes the 42-year-old Crowninshield upon assuming office as follows, quote, lantern-jawed, with short wavy hair and the newly fashionable sideburns framing a high forehead, Crowninshield gave an appearance of stolidity and calm. In an era when an unwritten requirement for secretaries of the Navy was personal experience with shipping, as a merchant, ship captain, or admiralty lawyer, Benjamin Crowninshield had the credentials for the post. And I've never heard this description before. Lantern-jawed.
Yeah, but is that like another way of saying like strong-jawed?
I'm assuming so. I'm thinking like kind of a boxy kind of jaw. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That is definitely.
It creates an impression.
Yes. Yes.
And so Monroe biographer Tim McGrath described Crownshield's entry into the Madison cabinet as, quote, a tonic for the president. And so, he's seen as kind of this breath of fresh air, this personable person who's coming in. And this is right after the War of 1812. Things are starting to get settled. So very interesting that he's coming in at this time.
Right.
And Mary, his wife, was fascinated by details of the social life of Washington, D.C. She asked her husband for details of, quote, what the women in Washington wore. So she's starting to really get interested in what this is like, after having, her sixth child, you can imagine she may have been getting a little stir crazy, when can I come?
Exactly.
The Madisons invited the new Navy Secretary to Montpelier for a visit when Congress wasn't in session, an invite that Benjamin would not take up, though. As Lanier notes, his wife, quote, was wide-eyed at this invitation. She was like, why are you not going? And he's like, I don't really need to go. She's like, no, go and report.
Yeah. Huh. That is interesting.
Yeah. And so one of the Navy's officers noted of Crowninshield that, quote, the secretary is certainly a very different man from Mr. Jones. There's a friendly affability and a conciliatory manner about him, extremely pleasing. Again from Lanier, quote, Crowninshield understood that a man with his family name, status, and wealth had an obligation to serve, but he enjoyed the friendships he made in Washington more than shaking hands with his innumerable visitors seeking patronage. So he's really starting to socialize. He's getting into the social life of Washington. That's really what's striking him.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that Crowninshield did that was a marked change from Jones's tenure was to rehire Charles W. Goldsborough, who was previously the chief clerk in the Navy Department. Prior to being fired by Jones in 1813, Goldsborough had served in the Navy Department since the early days of the first Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddard, and had even served as acting secretary for 2 months before then Secretary of the Navy, Paul Hamilton, took office. And then he served in this acting role again for 3 months while Hamilton was out of town in the first year of Madison's presidency. And so we talked about this more in Jones's episode, but he came in, kind of started clearing house, and he's like, yeah, this guy's been here a while. Things aren't really so great, so maybe we need somebody new in the role. But Crowninshield comes in and says, well, this guy's been here a while, and I'm new to the role, so let's get him back.
Okay.
But rather than being returned to his previous post, Goldsborough was brought back, quote, first as a member of the staff of, and later secretary to, the Board of Navy Commissioners, and would stay in the employ of the Navy Department until his death on December 14th, 1843.
Wow.
So this guy sees through the first few decades of the Navy Department.
That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. Meanwhile, the dispute between the chief clerk, Benjamin Homans of Massachusetts, and another clerk that Jones had brought in, Edward W. Duval, ended as Homans, who had been on the outs with Jones, was known by Crowninshield and increasingly looked to as a trusted confidant. So he comes in. This guy hadn't really gotten along with his predecessor, but he's like, I know this guy. We're both from Massachusetts. We can get along well. And so by early April 1816, Duval left the Navy Department, and as noted by McKee, quote, Benjamin Homans finally came into his own as chief clerk of the Navy Department. So, he's able to work with this new boss better and is finally able to really thrive in this role. And then as noted by McKee, quote, on the evening of 14th February 1815, when official news of the Treaty of Ghent ending the War of 1812 reached Washington, Secretary of the Navy Benjamin W. Crowninshield presided over the largest corps of naval officers the United States had ever assembled, more than 1,100 men. So the Navy has expanded to this large force, this large military presence. And Crowninshield is coming in and he's taking charge of this. But the end of the War of 1812 was soon followed with news of another conflict in the making. As the U.S. Navy had been either bottled up or focused on attacks against the British during the War of 1812, attacks on American shipping in the Mediterranean had picked up, and there had been no naval forces available to address the situation as had been done in the Jefferson presidency during the First Barbary War. But now, Madison and Crowninshield, as well as the rest of the cabinet, discussed the situation, and 2 squadrons of warships, the first commanded by Stephen Decatur and the second by William Bainbridge, were dispatched to take action against the Barbary forces in the Mediterranean. As Lanier notes, quote, Crowninshield apparently traveled to New York to visit the Guerriere and consult with Decatur personally in mid-May 1815. So he's talking with one of these chief commodores being sent off, trying to make sure, okay, here's your marching orders, here's what you got to do. So Decatur and his squadron made short work, and within days after their arrival, an agreement had been reached to return American captives held in Algiers, as well as a pledge of, quote, $10,000 in damages paid to the United States by the Algerine government and shipping rights to the Mediterranean. So this was a very quick naval operation. Within a couple of days, okay, we surrender. What do you want?
Wow.
And a further naval bombardment had to be made in 1816 to ensure the Algerine government's compliance. But by and large, this was a quick and easy naval war. And as noted by McGrath, quote, the first display of what the world would come to call America's gunboat diplomacy.
Okay.
So this is kind of where that starts. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1815, Crowninshield was presented with accusations that Lieutenant Thomas Ap Catesby Jones had committed, quote, an act of sodomy by an acting midshipman who Jones, quote, had taken disciplinary action against. And so this is, him having to get involved in kind of a personnel issue. There's this accusation made. The midshipman managed to get sworn depositions from 4 enlisted men, quote, recounting in specific and realistic detail homosexual encounters between themselves and Lieutenant Jones. Now, Crowninshield would ultimately conclude that, quote, having duly considered the accusation made against Jones and the evidence produced in support of said accusation, decided that it is malicious and vindictive and destitute of any proof upon which a court-martial or any other tribunal could condemn the said Lieutenant Jones. Crowninshield then dismissed the midshipman from the service. So he's saying, I've looked things over. I understand you're making these charges, but you were also disciplined by your superior officer, and that seems to be the reason that you're making these accusations. We don't need you in the service. So he's coming in, he's clearing this up and moving forward.
I have a question. I was under the impression that these relationships weren't consensual, but were they consensual? Do you know?
And that's the thing. And I researched a little bit into this. I'd like to research a bit more. It sounds like with some of the others that it was consensual, but the accusation from the midshipman was that it wasn't.
Okay.
And so that's kind of, he was trying to make a case that, this is previous behavior of Jones, but Crownинshield's like, I'm not really buying it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because when I read that and I thought that it was non-consent, like literally my mouth dropped open and I gasped that he just was like, never mind, forget it. It didn't happen. In fact, I was like, wait, what? No. But I think it does make a big difference, at least to me. If these relationships were consensual, then
yeah,
okay, fine.
Yeah,
then that would be malicious. But if it's I'm sorry. Anyway,
oh, no worries. Well, and it does speak to, and that's one of the things about studying same-sex desire in kind of the pre-modern context. It's sometimes difficult to figure out exactly what's going on because it was it wasn't something that was talked about regularly. And you just end up with some of these instances, and you have to piece together what's really going on from the primary sources that we have, and realizing that sometimes the reason it's brought up is not necessarily for a positive reason. In this case, it was an accusation and kind of a dispute between the two. It could be that there was more there and that this was something. And unfortunately, we see this in the modern context. We see accusations that are hushed up, and it's hard to figure out exactly what was happening. What I read, it sounded like it was more, he kind of concluded that this midshipman was just upset about having disciplinary action taken against him, but we'll never really know for certain.
Okay. That clarifies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is something to consider. And yes, it does. And especially if, depending on how this, it's a very different story, one versus the other. So,
yes.
Yeah. So, that, and I brought that up because that's an interesting kind of, you don't get that often at this stage in American history. So
no, like I didn't know what to expect, but I read that and was like, oh,
yeah,
like literally,
like,
oh my
wow.
goodness.
Okay.
Yeah. It's less scandalous if they were consensual, then okay, that's one thing. But
yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Oh, no worries. And so one of the things, and Lanier talks about this, so previous historians have kind of dismissed Crownинshield's tenure, but Lanier writes that, quote, nothing in the early months of Crownинshield's tenure as Secretary of the Navy supports David F. Long's claim that Crowninshield was weak and erratic, or Guthridge and Smith's assertion that Crowninshield was weak and indecisive. We're already seeing him kind of making decisions and sticking with them. And so I kind of agree with him here that, we're just not seeing that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in his personal life, Benjamin and his wife Mary's sixth child, a daughter named Annie, was born in September 1815. But sadly for the family, at some point during Crownинshield's tenure as Navy Secretary, his son Benjamin passed away on his 21st birthday. The younger Benjamin, who apparently attended Harvard at some point, had been suffering from a fever, and his father was summoned from D.C. However, Secretary Crowninshield had only gotten as far as New York before his son passed away. As noted by his granddaughter Louisa in her reminiscences, the secretary, quote, being very anxious and impatient, could not wait to drive the rest of the way, but hired a steamboat in order to hurry. It is interesting to know that the captain of this boat was Mr. Vanderbilt. And I'm assuming that's related to the Vanderbilts.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Louisa continues on, quote, unhappily, Grandpa was too late in reaching Salem, and his son was already dead. I was told when he arrived at the house he could not bear to go in, because he feared to hear bad news. So he walked up and down outside for a long while first. It was a sad blow to him. Uncle Ben had been very attractive and promising. My mother once told me that at his funeral was the first time she had ever seen flowers sent by friends for such an occasion.
Aw.
So really a sad loss for the family, and, somebody just so young.
Yeah.
Now, the family also suffered the death of Secretary Crownинshield's father, George, who passed away in Salem in June 1815 at the age of 80. So definitely a couple of major losses to the family.
Yeah, his son and his father. That's terrible.
But it does seem that towards the end of 1815, Mary was able to come to D.C. herself. She didn't have to rely on his reports on what everybody was wearing. She was finally able to come. And the Crowninshields attended a dinner at the Monroes, which Mary wrote to her mother about and pronounced, quote, the most stylish dinner I've been at.
Oh, good for her.
Yeah. So she's finally getting in the fun and is apparently impressed with Washington society.
Yeah. Oh.
When his fellow cabinet colleague James Monroe was elected president in 1816 and started to assemble his cabinet, he asked Crowninshield to remain in place at the Navy Department, to which he agreed. So, as described by historian George Dangerfield, Monroe, quote, had hoped to surround himself with men like himself, respectable men to whom duty was paramount, and who proposed to do as little of it as they conveniently could, not out of a lazy disposition, but from a deep respect for laissez-faire. Indeed, as noted by Lanier, quote, Benjamin Crowninshield served as Secretary of the Navy into Monroe's administration, although after the 1815 campaign, he was mostly content to let the department's clerks run the peacetime Navy. So he's starting to, things are winding down. We don't really need to do as much with the Navy. Y'all can handle this. I'll manage and supervise, but
right.
I'm just going to trust you to do your jobs.
Okay.
Now, keeping that steady hand at the Navy Department also had the added benefit of keeping a New Englander in his cabinet and working towards the geographic balance that the incoming president sought to achieve in his administration. So this is the time that, with the cabinet, with Supreme Court appointments, it was seen as important to have folks from all the different sections of the nation.
Yes. The era of good feelings.
Yes. So we are entering that, and Crowninshield seems like a good person for the era of good feelings. And Lanier notes that, quote, when James and Dolly Madison left Washington after Monroe's inauguration as president in March 1817, Crowninshield was the only civilian friend who accompanied them as they began their trip home to Montpelier.
Oh.
Yeah. So he's definitely making an impression on folks, it seems. Now, Crowninshield will be called upon, along with his new and returning cabinet colleagues, to help the new president with the draft of his first annual message to Congress, with the cabinet meeting with Monroe on November 28th to consider and debate over the language. Writing in his diary in early January 1818, in summing up the Monroe cabinet, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams concluded that, in their deliberations, Crowninshield, quote, will always be of the president's opinion. So he's saying this is kind of the president's he's going to be his yes man. He's going to always, that's great, sir.
Yeah. Huh.
Now, one of the issues that Crowninshield inherited from his predecessor was the feud between Captains Oliver Hazard Perry and Jesse Duncan Elliott. Without going too much into it, both of the captains who were involved in the critical Battle of Lake Erie on September 10th, 1813, questioned the other captain's contribution to its success and did what they could to tear the other down. So they're saying, oh no, I was the great one at the battle. No, I was the great one at the battle. You weren't doing anything. No, you weren't doing anything. And Elliot had been satisfied with the results of an earlier court of inquiry that Crowninshield had, quote, directed to develop a full statement of the facts in relation to Elliot's activities at the battle. But in 1818, upon hearing rumors that Perry was talking against him, wrote his fellow captain and renewed the conflict with Elliot challenging Perry to a duel. Instead, Perry, quote, drew up court-martial papers.
Oh my.
Yeah, he's like, I'm not dueling you. We're just going to court-martial you.
Yeah.
So, as noted by historians David Curtis Skaggs and Gerard T. Altoff, quote, Secretary Crowninshield and President James Monroe did not want two of the nation's most acclaimed heroes to confront one another in a public court. Nobody was going to come out looking well in this, and they knew that.
Yeah.
Again, from Skaggs and Altoff, quote, such trial would air dirty linen and bring the Navy into disrepute. We do not know entirely what happened, but the charges were not pressed to trial. So we can imagine probably behind the scenes, they're like, let's go ahead and cool it, guys. Let's be adults here.
Yeah.
Crowninshield was also involved in determining the administration's response to the taking of Amelia Island, which is an island that was part of Spanish Florida. So basically, a band of pirates had used it as a base of operations to attack all shipping in the area, including American ships, until they were displaced by a U.S. naval force. but this naval force was still kind of there. They were like, we don't want the pirates to come back. We're just going to hang around for a bit.
Okay.
So on January 6, 1818, Monroe met with his cabinet to discuss the situation. As noted by historian Kevin Gutzman, quote, Crawford, Crowninshield, and Wirt agreed with Monroe that the troops ought to be withdrawn from Amelia Island, while Adams and Calhoun thought the island ought to be held for use as a bargaining chip with Spain. So Adams and Calhoun are more of the Warhawk faction. They're like, we're there. Let's just use it. Maybe we can get something better out of a deal with Spain.
Right.
And everybody else is kind of like, we're kind of invading another nation's territory. That's not really that good.
No.
And so ultimately, Monroe released a special message to Congress, which defended the military intervention on the island, while at the same time asserting that the Spanish government in Florida needed to work to, quote, prevent the abuse of their authority in all cases to the injury of the United States, and that, quote, the territory of Spain will be respected so far as it may be done consistently with the essential interest and safety of the United States.
Okay.
So Monroe's taking kind of this diplomatic, having it both ways. He's saying, you know what, they need to work with us. We're going to respect their territory, but we're also going to look out for our own interest if they're not willing to do something to keep pirates from attacking our ships.
Right.
Now, the Adams-Onez Treaty of 1819 would settle matters once and for all, but we'll get to that in John Quincy Adams' episode because that's his story. But in 1818, Crowninshield joined a party accompanying President Monroe on a tour of Chesapeake Bay, which began at Annapolis, Maryland on May 28th. So this is part of, Monroe, he kind of took a cue from President Washington, and he wanted to visit all parts of the nation. And so this was part of that. It was still kind of close by, but it was seen as important. So Monroe, Crowninshield, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, General Swift, and the president's secretary, his brother Joseph Monroe, traveled, quote, mostly by revenue cutter, steamboat, or yawl. The original intent had been to sail down as far as Savannah, but Monroe ended up cutting the trip short. The trip was not a smooth one. As noted by McGrath, quote, when arrangements in Norfolk, Virginia fell apart, he, Monroe, snapped at Crowninshield in public.
Oh.
He later apologized, hoping he did not wound your feelings. Crowninshield replied in kind, but a rift had formed.
Okay.
So, just thinking of, having a boss that is basically telling you off in front of all these people, it's not good.
No.
Now, we really don't have too much more after this because, it's getting up and you really get the sense that this created that rift and Crowninshield was like, what am I really doing here?
Yeah.
Yeah. You would.
I had looked for a reason as to why Crowninshield left the cabinet so soon after, the tour was cut short. He left and I couldn't find a reason.
Yeah.
So that explains a lot.
Yeah. And Dangerfield cites as the reason for Crownинshield's departure from the cabinet, quote, sheer inanitation, which is defined as, quote, lack of mental or spiritual vigor or enthusiasm.
Oh my.
And that kind of, you can kind of, and it kind of makes sense when you know the story about the tour and this incident between them. Who's really going to be enthusiastic after that?
Yeah.
And thus, on October 1st, 1818, Crowninshield left his post at the Navy Department and returned to private life. And William H. Crawford, his biographer, Chase Mooney, wrote that, quote, only the Secretaryship of Navy was held by a man of second-rate abilities, and only that position changed hands during Monroe's presidency. And so this is an interesting, we're getting some interesting perspectives of folks on Crowninshield, this idea of him being a man of second-rate abilities. But we can talk more about that like when we get towards the end, but it's interesting. And this is the only position in Monroe's presidency that somebody else comes in. All the others, so Adams, Calhoun, Crawford, they all stay at their post all 8 years. But Crowninshield is like, I'm done, I'm out.
Interesting.
So upon leaving office, Crowninshield returned to Salem, Massachusetts. However, it would only be a few years before he returned to public service when he was elected to the Massachusetts State House of Representatives once more in 1821. He served in that office until being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives to represent the Massachusetts 2nd District, and he assumed that office in 1823. This meant that Crowninshield was present in Congress when Monroe sent his annual message to the legislature outlining what would come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. So he was there for that.
Okay.
Crowninshield wrote to former Secretary of War Henry Dearborn about the message on December 19, 1823, a few days after it had been delivered, and asserted that, quote, its general character is approved of at Washington, and from the Prince appears to give general satisfaction. So he's saying, yeah, we're kind of getting behind this idea of the Monroe Doctrine.
Okay.
Now, this congressional service put Crowninshield in Washington when politicos were debating the presidential caucus system that, for decades, had been utilized by the Democratic-Republican Party to choose their candidates for president and vice president. So basically, this was all the faction members in Congress coming together and choosing who was going to be put forward as president and vice president. But this was just the congressional members. Nobody else had any say-so.
Okay.
Yeah. And so with this system coming under increased scrutiny, as we'll explore in a bit more detail in the coming episodes on 1824 presidential candidates William H. Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and John C. Calhoun, they may have stuck around for 8 years, but all of them wanted to be president after Monroe.
Yeah.
But with this, Crowninshield commented in December 1823 that he, quote, did not see how the caucus would be held, since only Crawford's friends favored it. And that was one thing. Crawford was really the establishment candidate. His supporters really wanted the caucus. Everybody else was saying, hold on. We know you're going to get it locked up. Let's figure out something else.
Okay.
So during his first term in the 18th U.S. Congress, Crowninshield served as the chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee, which that's a pretty, you were Secretary of the Navy. This might be the role for you.
Yeah.
However, he would be succeeded as head of that committee in the next Congress by Henry Storrs of New York. As part of the anti-Jackson faction, Crowninshield would find himself in the minority in the 20th and 21st U.S. Congresses, winning re-election 3 times by a strong margin. However, Crowninshield lost his re-election bid in 1830 by nearly 1,000 votes to an up-and-coming politico named Rufus Choate. But before he left office, Crowninshield would be asked to weigh in on a claim on the federal government by the financially struggling former president under whom he had served, James Monroe. Monroe filed a claim worth over $60,000, which the House denied on February 3, 1831, by a vote of 98 for to 101 against, with Crowninshield being in the nays. You have to imagine he took a little satisfaction from, no, you don't get your money. I'll show you to embarrass me. But a proposal was made for a $30,000 settlement with Monroe, and Crowninshield was in the majority of 103 to 88 that approved it a day later. So you're not getting your full funds, but, we'll at least give you half.
Okay. Compromise.
Compromise.
Yes.
It's always amazing when that actually happens in Washington.
Yes. Imagine that.
I know, right? So Crowninshield returned to service in the Massachusetts State House of Representatives in 1833 as a representative from his new home district in Boston. Ultimately, though, he would retire from public life and resume his business pursuits. His wife, Mary, unfortunately predeceased him, passing away on October 5th, 1840 at the age of 62, and was buried at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Crowninshield himself passed away on February 3rd, 1851 in Boston at the age of 78. He also was interred at the Mount Auburn Cemetery with his wife. Now, one of the things to note here is that Crowninshield had many notable descendants, but two I would like to highlight are Ben Bradley, who is the famous editor of the Washington Post associated with the Watergate controversy. So this is a few generations down, but he was related to Crowninshield.
Okay.
Also, someone who will get his own episode of the special series is his great-great-grandson, Charles Francis Adams III, who served as Secretary of the Navy from 1929 until 1933.
Wow.
Yeah. So the legacy keeps going for a few generations.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
The family's old brick house on Derby Street in Salem was purchased in 1854 by Captain Robert Brookhouse, a merchant, quote, who made his fortune in West African trade. And in 1861, he donated it to the Association for the Relief of Aged Women. It continues on to this date as the Brookhouse Home, which, according to their website, quote, provides quality support to senior women, encouraging them to live active, satisfying lives both at home and within their community. And so this home can be found on the corner of Derby and Orange Streets in Salem. So if you're ever in Salem, check it out.
Okay. Wow.
And then the USS Crowninshield, a Wicks-class destroyer, was commissioned in August 1919, was named after him. According to Crownинshield's granddaughter Louisa, it, quote, was christened at Bath, Maine by one of the family, and the family and attendants, quote, were invited to tea by Captain Sampson, whose father so distinguished himself in the Spanish War. The family also gave various gifts as tokens for the ship's connection with their illustrious ancestor. The USS Crowninshield was initially part of the Atlantic Fleet, but it was decommissioned only a few years later in July 1922. It was, however, recommissioned in May 1930 and assigned to the United States Battle Force. It was in service for a few more years before being decommissioned again in April 1937. But this wasn't the end of the story for the USS Crowninshield, because it was recommissioned once more in September 1939 to serve in the Neutrality Patrol, which was a U.S. effort to patrol the waters of the East Coast for German U-boats. It would serve for 1 year before being decommissioned for the final time in September 1940.
Wow.
I know, it just kept coming back up. But April, that is the life and legacy of Benjamin Crowninshield. So what are your initial thoughts on Crowninshield?
Wow. So I'm so glad that you research as much as you do, because you added so much context to what I read. I had never heard of him before, and I did research, because I'm, like I say, I'm not an expert or historian. I'm just a dork. I just like, so I feel a lot kinder towards him.
Yeah.
After our talk, after all the context you've added, I feel like he was more balanced than I gave him credit for. And I think that's a big lesson for me as well, as far as, because I feel like I kind of judged him harshly. Like I wrote the numbers down that I would give it, and I'm like, oh wow, I really judged him harshly. And I think that all the context that you've added has helped me to even that out a bit, I guess.
Well, and I will say, like, Crowninshield is one of the more difficult ones that I've researched for this series to date, because he doesn't have a biography, and he, in most cases, it was just like a brief mention of him. It was like, oh, this guy was here. But then I started finding some sources, and it's like you get the story about Lieutenant Jones, you get the Second Barbary War, you get things like that. And it's like, okay, hold on, we've got some stuff to talk about here. And then when I found his granddaughter's family history, that was really a big one. It was like, okay, finally, we have the details. We have the what was it, 16-pound baby.
Yes.
I mean, it really started, but there's still so much more that I was like, oh, I just wish I could find out more about him. And there may be stuff in primary resources. I'd be interested for folks in Salem or in Boston. There may be some more papers in an archive somewhere that just nobody's really explored. So anybody who's looking for a research project, try Benjamin Crowninshield.
Yes.
But with what we know, we have to start to evaluate him. And that starts with our whole picture round. So this round looks at the overall character and career of this cabinet member. And we can each award up to 10 points maximum. So what are your thoughts on his overall career?
I think I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10. Maybe all the military experience he had is enough to push him up that one extra point from middle, but it's better than what I had originally given him. So,
well,
yeah.
And that's the thing. Like we see a clear rise here, and he never has a point that it's just a complete failure. You know, he does well enough. He does well in business. He starts to get into politics, and especially that meteoric rise. So he was still at the state level of politics when he became Secretary of the Navy. Yeah. And then after he leaves, he still gets involved in state and federal politics. And so it really is it the most glorious career? No. But it's not a failure. You know, we have some of these cabinet members who just, and we've had some that it's like, why is this person still continuing to advance? They fail at everything. He didn't. He is kind of that middle of the road. I think I'm going to go for a 5 here, but I think that really speaks to, you know, he was successful. He wasn't striving for greatness, but he did achieve enough that this is a good, solid career. And so that gives him an 11. So now we zoom in a little bit with the go-getter round, because this round looks at the impact of the cabinet member during their time in the cabinet. And again, just like the first round, we can award up to 10 points maximum.
Okay. And I think I'm going to give him a 6 here. My impression of him is he was just kind of like, he was there and he did it, but like, I feel like he was kind of propped up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think he was given a lot of things instead of more than earned, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, and you get the sense that he's kind of a solid figure. He does the job.
Yes.
He doesn't, except for whatever happened in Norfolk, Virginia, he didn't seem to mess up things. Yeah. And he really came in and he provided what was needed, you know, that personable touch with the Navy, with the actual people that his predecessor didn't have. He did provide what was needed at the time, but you also, and especially the comment by John Quincy Adams that basically he was always going to agree with Monroe.
Yeah.
A yes man can be good for making sure that there's kind of the solid, everybody's kind of in agreement that, you know, we all are working together. But what does that really contribute to the administration? What does that really contribute to the cabinet?
Right.
So I think I'm going to go middle of the road here as well. I'm going to give him a 5. He did the job. He did it well, but he didn't really make that big of an impact on the office or the administration. He provided kind of a solid, you know, this is kind of solid ground, but just not doing anything overly special.
Right. Yeah.
And so that puts him up to 22 points. But now we've got to consider the hot seat round. This round discusses any disgraceful behavior of or actions committed by the cabinet member and this disgrace does not have to be during their tenure of office in the cabinet, and we can each take away up to 10 points maximum.
Sorry, I'm debating. I'm debating whether to take away. Can I do half points?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'd like to take away 1.5 points from him then.
So what led you to 1.5 points?
Oh boy. It was a lot. It was a lot more.
Yeah.
But our conversation actually led me to take away less because I have more context to what was going on, and I'm still kind of side-eyeing that whole some of the things that he did, but I don't feel I can take away more than 1.5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I'm going to match you on that, just because, with the Lieutenant Jones affair, it seems like from what I was reading that it wasn't a cover-up. However, there's still the possibility that it was. And so I think we have to take a little bit of that into account. Also, the fact that the family profited from war,
Yeah.
That's kind of, that's kind of scandalous. But there's not much more than that. Well, and also you could possibly say, the fact that he voted against Monroe getting his money, was that just sour grapes or what? But
yeah.
or was it just, I was going to vote it no anyway, and then I found out who it was. So, but I think that 1.5 points from each of us, so that's 3 total that we're taking away. I think that accounts for anything that we may not necessarily have details of. It leaves kind of that possibility, and again, a family doesn't get that wealthy without having some skeletons in the closet. So that's kind of assuming that something's there. We may not know exactly what it is. So that brings him back down to 19, but he's got the opportunity to pick up a few more points, because in our tenure of office round, this is the entire time that a cabinet member served in a full-time capacity. So he was Secretary of the Navy from January 16th, 1815 to September 30th, 1818, nearly 4 years. So we go ahead and round up. So he gets 4 points there. And then with our bonus points, cabinet members can get a bonus point if they served in more than one full-time cabinet position. He did not. He only served in the Navy Department, but he does get a bonus point because he served as a full-time cabinet member in more than one presidential administration. He served under both James's, Monroe, and Madison, but he did not become president. It doesn't seem like he ever had any ambition to do so, so he does not get that bonus point. And so that gives him a total of 24 points at the end of this. But, April, we have one more question to consider. After all I've shared about Benjamin Crownинshield's life and career and what we've discussed, do you think that this cabinet member is notable enough or impactful enough to earn a seat at the table of the Cabinet All-Stars?
I'm going to have to say no, but less emphatically than I would have before our talk. Like, I have no written in my notebook, underlined 3 times. And now it's just no.
Just no. Maybe one underline, but no.
Yeah, I was pretty harsh on this guy.
Well, and it really speaks to, unfortunately, it seems like he managed well. He did the bare minimum.
Yeah.
But you don't become a cabinet all-star with bare minimum. So no. I agree with you. I think that he's just going to have to go off. I think he can build his own table, his own dining room. He'll be fine.
Yes.
But April, I cannot thank you enough for being here. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through the life and career of Benjamin Crowninshield, and, getting to explore somebody who doesn't get a lot of attention in even presidential history circles.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for picking this gentleman. Crowninshield was very interesting, and I really enjoyed our talk. This has been an absolute joy. Thank you.
And likewise, thank you so much. And for our listeners, once you get done with this episode, please do check out the Door Key podcast, which I always love that name. I think every history podcaster would say we are all a bit dorky, and that's fine. We're living into it. So, but check out the Door Key podcast. I will have a link on the page for this episode. I'll also be sharing information on my social media around the release of this episode. The website is presidenciespodcast.com. So check it out there. And April, again, thank you so much. And for our listeners, thank you for listening. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Before there was internet fraud and phone scams, there were always swindlers. Female swindlers too. Discover the stories of women from the past who not only survived but thrived as con artists and thieves. How did they use their feminine characteristics to swindle in a world where men made the rules? Join me, Lucy Worsley, historian and author, and my all-female team in Lady Swindlers, wherever you get your podcasts.